Hello. Welcome to the show about stuff, the Stephen Davis Show.
Welcome to a podcast show about stuff. It's the show about stuff, the Stephen Davis Show. Here's your host, Stephen Davis.
Hi, I'm Lady Dr. Deanna Ziegler, President and CEO of Z Creators and Professor Emerita at Florida A&M University School of Journalism and Graphic Communications. I am also the author of the award-winning book, Midnight Train from Georgia. Midnight Train from Georgia is the story of William Franklin Guest, a founding member of the iconic singing group Gladys Knight and the Pips. William tells a story of the evolution of the group from their childhood roots in the gospel church in Atlanta, Georgia, to becoming global superstars. He shares the journey that took them from Atlanta to New York City's famous Apollo Theater, Detroit's Motown Records, and Buddha Records, where they recorded hit after hit, winning American Music Awards, Grammy Awards, leading to their induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. William is my brother-in-law, so I've lived this story since I was 11 years old, and it was quite a journey. Midnight Train from Georgia is a story about family, faith, love, the entertainment industry, and harmony, where harmony is more than just the blending of voices, it's the blending of spirit. Midnight Train from Georgia is available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Order your copy today.
Hello to all of you. Welcome to the show about stuff, the Stephen Davis Show. Today, my guest, the prolific Bill Easley, is a jazz saxophonist, clarinetist, and a flautist. Over the years, he's played with fellow musicians from George Benson to Isaac Hayes, Al Green and Peoples, to Jimmy Smith, Grady Tate, Mercer Ellington, and the incomparable Ruth Brown. He has recorded as a sideman to the fact that he released his own recordings also. Please welcome Mr. Bill Easley.
Good morning. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here to talk about stuff.
I'm happy to have you here.
My head is full of it.
And I must give a shout out to the person that brought us together, Deborah McFadder. Thank you so much, Deborah.
Yeah, thank you.
How I always generally start off the show, and it's because I want to get some idea of you, the person. First of all, where were you born at?
I was born in Olean, New York, which is right on the Pennsylvania border of the southern tier of the New York state. And my family was there from the early 1900s. They migrated from Pennsylvania because of the different laws in Pennsylvania, because it's all, if you look at a picture of my family in 1906, it's about like a rainbow. It's every shade from dark black to almost white. So that's kind of like most African Americans, when they look at their DNA, we're mixed up.
What part of Pennsylvania was your family from?
Oh, geez, let me think of the town. There's various laws. My grandmother went to the Conservatory of Music in Meadville, Pennsylvania. So there's a lot of little other towns around there but eventually they moved into New York State. But as I say, my grandmother went to a conservatory in the late 1800s.
Were they anywhere near York, Pennsylvania?
again, now my wife's people, that would be a whole nother story. They're from around York and that area. I can't think of this one town. I'm having a senior moment right now. In fact, I have a cousin that still lives there. I can't think off the top of my head. I can't call the name of the town.
Tell us about your parents.
My mother, as I say, her mother was a piano player and taught piano in her house. So my mother learned the piano basically just by listening to her teach the other students. Because sometimes a parent can't teach their own child. So my mother learned just by paying attention to her mother giving lessons to everybody else. And my mother was a master musician. Not only could she read the most difficult piano scores, and she could hear paint drying in the next room. And you'd come up with a new tune, and she'd come up with the chord changes right away. My father was on the road with a 5-piece band in 1926. And they had a job in my hometown, Olean, New York. And when they got to Olean, New York, the saxophone player in the band, who was the father of Stanley Turntine, had to go back to Pittsburgh for a family emergency. So so they needed a local saxophone player, and African American or colored back in those days. And so my Uncle Dar came to play with their band on this job, and he introduced my father to his piano playing sister Lois, and they were 19. Right away, they started making music together. And they had a band from then on. In their spare time, they had 7 children. And I was the last.
Spare time.
Spare time. But the point is, that was 1926. And my father became a local, it's primarily white population town. But my father was coming from outside. And I asked some of the older musicians about when my father came to town, and the only thing they could say is, Bob Easley turned this town upside down. And I imagine just not only with rhythm, but my father was really a very brilliant man and an organizer, especially later on with unions, the labor union and the grain millers union. And my house was the musicians union. I grew up in that was my house. And all the musicians in town, including classical musicians, polka band musicians, square dance band, came to my house to pay their dues and to file contracts. From the time I was a little boy, all the musicians in town came to my house because that was the union. Back in the day, musicians unions in mostly northern cities like Boston, Buffalo, Philadelphia, Chicago had segregated locals. They had the colored local and the white local. My father, Bob Easley, wrote the charter of the first merger of a black and white local, which were the 2 Chicago locals. And the laws of the land were changing to where all of the other locals had to merge because segregation was no longer the law of the land. So the last 2 musicians to merge were Buffalo and Philadelphia. And the thing is that I only know because I remember hearing about as a child, the people didn't want to merge, especially the black musicians, because they had their own thing going and they were doing very well. At Buffalo Union, they had their club, and anytime musicians would come down, and it's still in existence, but they had their own thing going. And so it was at that time when there was a fork in the road. And now there was a fork in the road. Should we integrate or should we separate, do our own thing? And that was a fork at that time. And I'm sure if you're as old as I am, you can remember that time and know what was going on. So unfortunately, fast forward, and you see the results. But I don't know if you ever saw this, but Harry Belafonte, if you go on YouTube and you'd see Martin Luther King's last words to Harry Belafonte. I don't know if you've ever saw this, but He's speaking to a Democrat, speaking to Obama, and he's speaking to Hillary Clinton, and he's talking about his last meeting with Dr. King. And he says, "You don't look very happy." And so he says, "I know all of these laws are getting ready to be signed into law, but what I'm worried about is that we are integrating into a burning building." So that's when you look back and then you fast forward to now, you really understand what Dr. King was feeling at that time. And then naturally on the other side, you got Malcolm and his separation from his where he was originally. He changed his mind about a lot of things. But both of them were dead at 39. So
it's true.
You know what I mean? So fast forward you got to know all this stuff to understand now.
Interesting thing about what you're saying is you yourself. And what I mean by that is from the time of birth on forward, you chose to be a musician, but you knew the rules of the game because your father taught you. Because he didn't just keep it to himself or his folks. He especially taught it to his family.
Right. Oh, I could speak about 10 hours without stopping about what I learned at my house, 317 South 3rd Street. And let me give, and like I say, because on my street, it was actually an integrated street. There were maybe half and half white people and black people when I grew up. Now, but my as I say, my house was a musicians union, and plus my grandfather had pretty much built that house, my mother's father. And then his father was a barber and also a very heavy into the Masonic movement, and he'd go to the conventions and have to wear top hat and tails. In fact, he owned the house next door.
Reminds me of Kingfish and Amos and Andy.
yeah. But not as stereotypical as what those characters. They weren't the same kind of characters. You understand?
But I'm talking about going to the lodge.
You're absolutely right, man. Because he had bought this house, 315 South 3rd Street, and he had to go to this convention in Washington and you had to have top hat and tails. He put a second mortgage on the house to buy his new clothes and eventually lost the house. You can't make this stuff up, man. And many years, I bought that house. I bought the property where that house was. And when you looked at the history of it, it ended up being owned by some other people in the town. And some of the relatives lived there for years and years, but they never owned the house. And eventually the house was falling down. But I remember every detail of all of this just like it was yesterday.
Now talk about your grade school in the town that you went to.
Okay. I had the same kindergarten teacher that was there from the time my mother was in the 1st grade, Miss Jessup, kindergarten. And the school was actually walking distance from the house. I remember my first day, my sister was getting ready to go to college, but she had a job cleaning some white folks' houses. And so she dropped me there on the way to work, and she pointed to the door, and she said, "There it is." I tell this to my wife. She can't believe that a little 5-year-old, nobody took him into the school. We were raised to be independent. I had six sisters, older. So when I would go to school, and I was the only brown skin, and so naturally back in those days, I guess I can't say the word anymore, but they used to call me the N-word. I understand. Normally I don't say the N-word. I use the word because I remember it. But my sisters would tell me that anytime that anybody called me that N-word, I had to beat them up. So starting in kindergarten, when somebody called me the N-word, after school or at lunchtime, I'd grab them and knock them down and grab their head and put them in a headlock until they hollered uncle. And sometimes I'd have one fight a day. Sometimes I'd have 2 fights a day, all through kindergarten, all through 1st grade. And after a while, it wasn't so much the N-word. I just love to beat somebody up. You understand? I just couldn't wait. Please call me that word so I can beat you up. You understand? And it's in my personality. That gruff, tough guy is still in a part of me. But by the time
You sound like the guy that was from the story, The Three Musketeers, where each musketeer that he met, he made a date to fight them.
Man, I swear, when I was if I was in the third grade, I'd find out who's the toughest guy in the fourth grade and set up a fight. You understand? For no reason. But after a while, like I say, nobody called me that anymore. But then I'd start playing football, so I put my aggression into football from about 9 years old.
Were your sisters more than you? You were the
This-
what order were you?
I was the youngest. My youngest sister was 9 years older than me. I was born on my one sister's 16th birthday, and there was a sister older than her. So they were from 17 years older than me to 9 years older than me. So in fact, I had 7 mothers growing up. You understand? And so as a result, and I've been married 3 times. You understand? So I love women. You understand? I would rather hang out with some women than hang out with you or any man.
Now, talk about your high school. You would play football.
Grade school, high school. See, football was my life. Football was my life from the time I was 9 years old. I lived and breathed football. I still played music, but that was secondary. And the Pittsburgh Steelers used to do their early training at St. Bonaventure's University, which is right in my town. So all of the black players would come to our house. And this was right, say, for instance, when Jim Brown first joined the Cleveland Browns had a fullback by the name of Marion Motley.
I remember Marion Motley, yes.
There you go. Well,
yes.
Marion Motley came to our house, you understand? And all of the other black players came to our house when they had time off. And I was just 9 years old. And so from that point on, and then Jim Brown, from the time I was 9 or 10 years old, I wanted to be Jim Brown. You understand? So when I got to high school, see, I quit growing in the 8th grade, but I was so fast and so good that they put me right on the varsity when I went to high school, right, as a freshman. But I was 5'5" and I weighed 127 pounds. You understand? From my kindergarten and first grade of training, I would try to find the biggest cat on the field and knock him down.
This past year, I did a show, and I had 3 guests at that time. One person was Bobby Hunter, who used to be on the Harlem Globetrotters.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And I had Dr. Richard Allen Williams, but I also had on Walter Beach.
Who?
Walter Beach.
Walter Beach. Okay. Yeah.
Now, Walter Beach, in the 1964 game of the Cleveland Browns for the championship, it was Jim Brown in the backfield.
I remember.
In the corner was Walter Beach.
I remember it. And the other running back, what was his name? Because him and Jim Brown had a little falling out. I'm trying to think of his name. No. Wait
Leroy Kelly?
No, I get these senior moments every once in a while. But I could remember, I could almost look at it. I can see the game on television.
Yeah, Walter Beach was in the show, and he talks about that game, being in that game. He's 92 years old now.
See, we used to get Cleveland on our TV on the game. But see, later on, my first cousin was married to Ben Davis, who played for the Cleveland Browns, but he was also the brother of Angela Davis. But Ben Davis played with Cleveland, and then he went with Chicago. He's family. And all the time when they were when they were looking for Angela, they had their phones blocked, bugged, and all of that. And I've met Angela a few times over the years. Yeah.
Now, tell me the atmosphere of going to high school.
Okay.
I know that you, by that time, you were taking out your aggressions on the football field.
Time I was in high school, I was highly respected. In other words, I was captain of the football team as a junior. I was president of the band, president of the chorus. I was very popular, and I was very busy with, and plus I was really into my music by that time. And so looking back, all my efforts were put into football or music. I think I opened a book one time or something. But I wasn't your world's greatest student. You understand? I mean, it's one that I couldn't do it because I was just occupied with the other aspects of my life. And a lot of times I would not do my homework or something, and then you get knocked off your grade. So I could do it. And when I put my mind to it, I could be an A student. I remember one time I got in English. I didn't do my homework at the whole grading period, and I think I got a 50 in English. And I might have been a freshman in high school. My father looked at my report card. He says, a moron could do better than that. So then on my next grade, I got like maybe a 95. But that's the only time I've ever been compared with a moron. So that felt terrible. That felt terrible. My father was literally a genius. He had photographic memory. He could read a book and then in a couple hours, and you'd turn to a page and you'd ask him a question. And he had a memory, I don't know. He couldn't pound a nail or he couldn't do anything handy, but he had a tremendous brain. And my father talked twice as much as I do.
Whoa. Now, during that particular time in school, and you were into your music, did you do any performing while you were in grade school or high school?
I started working in my parents' band when I was 13 years old. When I was in the 8th grade, I started playing, and I got paid. The first time they had me play with them, and it was a high school dance, and I would be an addition to the band. They had a 4-piece band, and when they have a job for 5 pieces, I would be the 5th piece. I just played clarinet at that time. And so the first gig we made, he paid me $5 out of his pocket. But every gig after that, the scale for a job was $12 a gig. So you got to realize $12 a night. And that's when most people were working for $1 an hour. So that was pretty good money. So my father signed for a note to buy my first decent clarinet when I was in the 8th grade. And I got a loan, and it was $330, but it was my bill. The monthly payments were $12.50. So I had to at least get 1 gig a month in order to pay my bills. And it's been the same thing for 66 years since then. I have to make enough money to pay my bills. But it started way back when I was 13 years old.
Tell me, when you did your first gig and you faced the audience, you came out and the audience was now seeing this kid coming out, how did you feel?
The first job was actually at a high school dance. And some of the kids that were a couple of years older than me. Naturally, I knew them. And naturally, it was exciting to be actually performing and also to be making some money. But mostly what we played was country clubs, moose clubs, the Elks Club, the Lions Club. And so in an area of maybe 50 miles, we did a lot of gigs down in Pennsylvania, or all of the little towns in that area. This is like when television was new. So in this little town of 20, there was more live music. We had a symphony orchestra. You had 2 or 3 big bands. You had dozens of little combos, swing bands, dance bands, polka bands, square dance bands. He had all of these working musicians. Some of them were full time, and some of them had other jobs too. My father always had another job. Sometimes my father would work 8 hours a day and come home and change his clothes and go and get behind the drums and make people happy.
So your father played the drums?
Drums, absolutely. I got his bass drum head stand up on my wall when you walk into my house. Back when I started listening to the modern saxophone players like Cannonball and John Colder, I'd get on the gig and I'd be trying to play all of this slick stuff that I'd gotten off the records. And so my father would holler at me. He'd say, play the melody. In other words, play the melody. And because that's what people want to hear, you see. And that advice has helped me to survive very well for 66 years. Because as jazz evolved, people got into a different way of playing, and they tried to play to impress, so to speak. Whereas the older music, Louis Armstrong and the originators of the music, they knew that their job was to make the people feel good. As we progress, sometimes a musician's job is to go up and show somebody how important they are, and aren't I great? And clap, I'm amazing, look at me. And so naturally they've lost. That's why jazz used to be what you call popular music. It became less popular music, and it became music for the hip crowd, but it lost the masses of people. In other words, the hipper than thou ran away all the squares, and the squares had all the money. So that's what's happened over time.
Now, when you left high school, did you go to college or any type of schooling?
I went right to New York at 18 years old. I went part-time at the Extension Division of Juilliard School of Music. But I went to New York at 18 years old, and I had a background. I could play when I got to New York, so it didn't take me long before I was a working musician in New York City. And for a short time, I got a job at the bank. First, it was called First National City Bank at that time, and I'm going to school. And I'm hanging out at the clubs playing till 4 o'clock in the morning. And I look back, I don't think I slept, but I was busy. And I made at the bank, I made $60 a week, 5 days a week, 8 hours a day. And the guy called, I played a job with somebody in New York. And on a Monday morning, his name was Sonny Allen. And it was a band called Sonny Allen and the Rockets. I'm at work on Monday, and he calls me. He said, man, my saxophone player didn't show up. I need you to come and join us. We'll pick you up, and we're going to Hazleton, Pennsylvania. So I make a long story short, I quit my job and I went up to 145th and St. Nicholas. That's where I was, and they were waiting for me. And I packed my clothes and got my horn and got in at a station wagon, because it was a 4-piece band and there was 3 girl singers. And pulling the trailer was a station wagon. Some people were sitting riding backwards. So before we got over to George Washington, and I just met the girls, and at some point I said, oh yeah, and I quit my job. And the girl said, you quit your what? And I knew I was in trouble then, because we worked 2 weeks. Oh, the guy promised me, he said, now weeks that we're off, I'm going to give you $75. People have been lying since the beginning of the time. So I said, $75, that's more I'm making here at the bank. But I never did see one of those $75. That's when I discovered Denny Moore's beef stew. And I would buy a can of Denny Moore's beef stew, and I'd eat half today and half the next day. But I was happy as a lark. But when I look back at some of these hard times, I wouldn't trade it for $10 billion.
You came out of the age of the Vietnam era.
Absolutely.
What was your experience in terms of, did you have to go into the Army? Did you go into the Army?
Absolutely. In other words, here I was in New York, and by this time, I had a job in a nice jazz club, walking distance from where I live, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, making $75 a week. which was more money than I could possibly spend at that time. My room rent was about $13 a week, but at that time I'm making $75 a week, and I wasn't even. I knew all my friends were getting drafted, and I never. I thought I was going to school, but I just part time, so I wasn't exempt. But getting drafted in the Army was the last thing on my mind. And you get mail, and sometimes I wouldn't open it because it'd say, oh, join the Army and see the world or whatever. But I knew that the key word was greetings. And so I opened some old
That was
mail.
the word.
Yeah, I opened the mail, and the first thing I saw was greetings. So I was drafted. I was 19 by then. I'm 19 years old. I was drafted into the Army. Now, a guy worked at the Union. I was a friend of my father's, and he gave me a number to call when I got to Fort Dix, because usually you go in through Fort Dix. So anyway, I when I did get drafted and I went to Fort Dix, and you got thousands and thousands of young men there from all over, and they're sending them to Fort Hood and sending them to Fort all over the country. That was just with the what they call it, reception station, or Fort Dix. And so before you take tests, get shots, before I could get anybody, I called the band right away. Called the band. And I told them that such and such told me to call them, and all I can do is play music. I said, I can't even tie my shoes. All I can do is play these horns. So they got me out of my group at that time to go take an audition at the band. So the first sergeant, he gave me my audition soda, and he had me play. And I could play because I'd been making my living doing it. And they have you play the national anthem from memory or whatever, and play this and play a march and play some tunes. So I could play some tunes. And in fact, hey, man, do you know, I remember Clifford, man. Can you play me in zero? So right away, man, he's, oh, great. And he said, you do your basic here, and then you'll come right here into the band at Fort Dix. And he said, where are you from? I said, I'm from near Buffalo, because I knew he hadn't heard of Olean. So, oh, man, we just got a guy that just come in the band from Buffalo, man. His name's Grover Washington, man. You know him? And that time, I didn't know Grover Washington. Grover was in the band at Fort Dix before I got there. So, to make a long story short, all through basic training, I figure I'm going to be going right into the band at Fort Dix. And I'd be right near New York, so I could still continue to do what I'd been doing. But somehow my orders got mixed up, and I get sent down to the Navy School of Music in Little Creek, Virginia. And I was there temporarily waiting for my orders, what I thought was going to be going to right back to Fort Dix. But right away, they found out I could play. So they offered me a job to stay there at the school and to teach, and they would make me automatic E5. You're private at that point. You understand?
Wow.
But they were going to make me E5 just to play in the faculty band. But in order to do that, I would have to sign up for another year. You understand? And so I'm like, no, I don't want to sign up for another year. So I turned it down, thinking that, no, the guy already told me I'm going to come back to Fort Dix. So finally, when my orders, I was there about 6 weeks. When my orders came in, and this great big Marine, you'd have to go report to. He's a E9, but about 6'14", with shoulders as wide as mule, great, and mean. And I walk into his office, and he's sitting there at his desk, and he looks at the orders. He says, Easley, 9th Army Band, Fairbanks, Alaska. And I thought he was joking with me. I said, oh, man, come on, man. And he looked at me like I'd lost my mind. To talk about, oh, man. And he, don't you see here? It says APO Seattle, Washington, man. So that's where I spent my 18 months in Fairbanks, Alaska in the 9th Army. But I also had a 6-piece band all the time I was up in Alaska, and played all the NCO clubs and little joints and local joints around Fairbanks. So I had it made. I spent 18 months. It's dark all winter and light all summer. So It was a blessing.
When you get out the Army, do you come back to New York?
Back to New York. And
Back
again,
to New York. Okay.
absolutely. But you got, by the same token, here you are. By the time I get out of the Army, I'm 21 years old because I turned 20 in basic doing KP on my 20th birthday. But I turned 21 up in Fairbanks, and I'm trying to figure out. I say, now what am I going to do when I get out of the Army? Because when I was in New York, I was doing real good, but I don't have youth going because they like me because I'm a young cat that could play. But when I get out, man, I'm gonna be an old man at 21 years old, man. What am I gonna do?
Oh, 21 years old.
I stopped in Seattle, Washington on one of my leaves, and I went to see Miles. And he was working in Seattle, Washington at a place called the Penthouse or something like that. But my plan, there's a story on YouTube about my Miles experience. But to make a long story short, I was going to go see Miles. And then when they took a break, I was going to go up to hello, Miles. My name is Bill Easley, and I play saxophone. And Miles, oh, really? Why don't you go get that? Was my plan, but it didn't turn out that way. But there's somebody put a video of me telling the story on YouTube, but it just, if you Google Bill Easley and Miles Davis, I don't want to waste your time not telling you the story, but it was a point of reckoning and a point of to where you just wanted to just quit. I said, man, let me get out of show business.
You have to tell gist of it. You already started it.
The gist of the story was that once I heard those guys playing with Wayne Shorter and Herbie Hancock and Tony Williams and so, it was so far over my head that I thought it was some guys from outer space that had come down. And I stood up and I watched the band, and it was like an out-of-body experience. And the voice in my head, as clear as a bell, the voice said, go back to your hotel and hide under the bed. Because that's what I could, because it was so humiliating. And so now I'm trying to get out of there. And I'd forgotten about my regular plan, but I'd left my hat under the chair. So I feel these piercing eyes, and Miles got my hat in his hand, and he says, is this what you're looking for? And I grabbed my hat and I ran out of the club, and I said, you know what, this music thing maybe I should stay up here and become a lumberjack or something. But I got over it in a few days, and the voice in my head said, you got to get with a giant. In other words, in order for you to take it to the next level, you got to get with a giant. So I got back to my horn and started listening. I got out of the Army at the end of November. By January 1st, I'm out on the road with George Benson, and that was 2 years. But again, it was like, well, I can only explain it as divine intervention. And
how was it being with George Benson?
Oh, it was the greatest learning experience of my whole life, because we were working. You'd work a club for 2 years. You'd work the original Minton's Playhouse. You played the Plug Nickel in Chicago, Hurricane in Pittsburgh. You played jazz places, and so we played the Vanguard in New York. One time we played the Vanguard opposite Herbie Hancock. Next time we played there was opposite Bill Evans. Played festivals, and I would see Miles. I would see Duke Ellington. I would see Monk. And I was in the big time. But I knew I wasn't really at my fullest potential. And George was a monster. George just played the guitar just like you wanted to set fire to it. And then when I take my turn, two of the greatest lessons of my life, because we never talked about music. We never had a rehearsal. We didn't have any music. We just played. So there were times on the bandstand in that 2-year period, the two greatest lessons of my life. Sometimes George would holler at the bandstand. He'd say, listen. And I'm 21, 22 at that, and I am listening. What do you mean, listen? I'm listening. And then sometimes, and George plays a lot of notes. So on my horn, I try to be running off of my horn, playing, and that's not how he wanted me to function. And so sometimes before I'd start my solo, he'd holler at me in that same tone, and he'd say, "Play funky." And I'm like, I certainly am playing funky. I don't know, but it took me.
I didn't take a bath this morning.
But anyway, that was, I call him. That was 1968 to 70, and later on, George became a huge superstar. He was great then, but he crossed over, and to the general public, he became a star. But to this day, there are sometimes when I call him just to thank him for that 2-year period, because we didn't make a lot of money. I don't want to, because later on I end up working with Isaac Hayes. So when George sees me, he always assumes that my period with Isaac Hayes was the greatest. But no, even though I made much less money, my period with him was the greatest 2 years of my musical career. And I've done 10 Broadway shows. But when I look back, and I've been paid, I've worked some jobs. One time I worked with Jessie Norman, and she handed me a pocket full of money. I have a wheelbarrow full of money. I played a few jobs to where I made money that the average back in the day took them a whole year to make. And then I worked for $10 too. But it's not all, there's much more to playing music than playing music. And just in our society today, in other words, it says on our currency, even though we have a separation of church and state, but on our currency it reads, "In God we trust." But if you pay attention to right now, they talking about that green God. That green God.
Now, tell me something. You said you played with Isaac Hayes. What years was it that you played with Isaac Hayes?
Right after Shaft. In other words, he had just won the Academy Award for Shaft.
Oh, so you didn't play on Shaft?
Not on the original. We recorded it on live, and we played it every night. I wasn't on the original record of Shaft. I was on another record where he played Shaft live at the Sahara Tahoe.
Oh, okay. I remember that album.
Yeah.
Well, you were part of that.
Yeah.
Okay.
See what happened, how that came about. His arranger was a brilliant musician by the name of Anzi Horn, but he got out of the music because he was in insurance and real estate. He taught at Manassas High School, where Jimmy Lunsford had taught. You understand? Jimmy Lunsford migrated north with most of the guys from the high school band.
About 2 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, I had the privilege. I was trying to get him to come on the show, but it was during COVID. So it really didn't happen. But I got a chance to meet and talk with David Porter.
Yeah. I knew my son, for my 80th birthday, my oldest, one of my sons, just sent me a Stax shirt because not only did I work with Isaac, but I was doing all the horn sessions at Stax at that time.
Oh, so you were part of that Stax team.
Stax, and also with Willie Mitchell at High and Al Green. Yes, and so I worked. I was busy, man. I made a good living in Memphis. I had left New York, but I ended up. It changed my life because I bought my first new car, had a house. I lived way better than musicians live in New York. So it set the trend for, once I moved my family to New York in 1980, I had to do it in such a way that I didn't lower their standard of living. So I ended up buying a house in Long Island and came up pretty affluent. I always had a working wife too.
Now, did you ever, I'm going to ask you a question that just popped into my mind. I noticed that you worked with Grady Tate.
Yeah, one of my running buddy.
Did you ever play with him at Possible 20?
I played gigs with Grady. I made records with Grady.
Do you remember Possible 20?
Yeah, but I'm trying. But see, you got to. This is what was during certain periods of time. I was so busy running from here to there that I didn't know where I was half the time. Even on the road, when you're traveling and you're doing one nighters in Europe, and you're in this.
Possible 20 was here in New York on 55th Street.
Yeah, of course.
But I used to have an office around the corner.
Okay, well,
so,
was that sort of a hangout place too?
Yes, it was a hangout place, but Grady would play there.
Yeah. Now that you mention it, again, and there's stories that I can't even tell.
But we used to, because one of my buddies, Willis Reed, was good friends with.
Wayman Reed?
I'm sorry, Willis Lee.
Okay.
Was good friends with Grady Tate.
Yeah.
We would walk around and listen to him play, and watch all the women at the bar.
I'll put it this way. Let me tell you about my relationship with Grady. Could consume. In other words, he could drink and consume.
Yes.
I was a lightweight, but Grady loved hanging with me because it justified. I would try to keep up with him, but he knew that I was real straight. I wasn't an alcoholic. And there are certain guys that I hung with that hung with me because they felt safe with me. But if I would suggest, let's call so-and-so. Oh, he's alcoholic. But they were alcoholics too. But since they were hanging with a nice guy like me, that made them nice like me. But I would match them stroke for stroke. One time we're doing the show Black and Blue, but me and Grady had taken off to do something else. We missed the matinee. So Grady, after this job, come on, man, let's go have a taste. So we go over across the street and we have a taste. And one drink, and as you're finishing your one drink, Grady has already ordered short signal to the bartender to give you the second drink. Have the second drink, and then Grady orders the third drink, and you figure since he's already paid $2 for your drinks, you got to have a third drink. Now, if you can get out of there, then you're okay. But if you have that fourth drink, you enjoy. So we were hanging out. And so I'm looking at my watch, and it's time to go play the night show. And Grady, we got to go to work. And Grady looks and he straightens up. He said, "What do you mean we?" He said, "I took off tonight. And the sun was, I got out and the sun hit me, boy, and I feel like my head was going to explode." And by the time I get there for that night show, man, took me everything I had, even just to put my horn together, man. You understand? And he did that to me good 3 times over the years. And he loved to do it. And then he would tell the story and exaggerate the story and make fun of you, and people would just be dying laughing, man. But literally, that's the first time he did it, but he did it more than once. And I had a lot of friends like that.
Now tell me, the other person I want before we get too far gone is your experience first working with Ruth Brown.
Ruth Brown, yeah.
And then your Broadway experience.
I met Ruth Brown over in Paris when they were doing Black and Blue in Paris before they came to New York. And so that's where I first met her. But I worked in her band from that point on. And her career was on an uprise, and she won the Tony for Black and Blue. And she had a lawyer that helped her get money, residuals, not just her, but a lot of other R&B's. There's a lawyer in Washington that was a fan, and he ended up getting them some nice pieces of money from record companies that had gotten rich off of them. They used to call Atlantic Records the house that Ruth built, because she was selling records way back in the late 40s, early 50s. She was a superstar. So I worked with her and for 20 some years. And the one thing that when I think of Ruth Brown, this is the one thing that I remember. When she would take the band out to dinner, as soon as she would sit down, Ruth Brown would make an announcement. She said, "Don't look at the right side of the menu. In other words, don't look at the price. Get what you want. You understand? In other words, she's taking you to dinner, so don't worry about what it costs about. So, in other words, do not look at the right side of the menu. Get what you want. But fast forward, that's not just the dinner order. That's a way of life. You understand? You live your life in such a way that if you want something, get it. So that little expression right there set the tone for the rest of my life. Now that's just one little thing. Now I could talk all day long about how much fun we had, man, and how much joy and love, man. It was just a beautiful time. Blessed, man, to be in a lot of situations, man, to where you just couldn't wait to go to work, man, because it was. And I don't use the word fun because sometimes, anytime somebody calls me for a job and they start off by telling me how much fun I'm going to have, I know what's coming next. I know it don't pay nothing. So I try to stay away from the fun word. But I love fun as much as anybody, man. And I've probably had more fun than any 10 people anyway.
Now, your Broadway experience.
Broadway, yeah. Broadway started. See, I went when Stax folded up. Stax went closed. Isaac went broke, and so I've been doing well for a long time, man. And I bought a house in Memphis, and the bottom dropped out, especially with those two things. Stax and Isaac Hayes, they were auctioning off Isaac Hayes' children's toys in the new. He went way down from superstardom to embarrassment. At some point, right after Duke died, the Ellington band came to town, and Duke had died maybe a few months before. And so the personnel was changing, but they really needed somebody a clarinet player, because the clarinet is a very important voice in Ellington music. So so they came to Memphis, and somebody told me, call Bill Easley. And some of the guys in the band I already knew from years ago. And so when they saw me, and so I went out with the band for a while. But at that time, I was working both with Isaac Hayes and the Ellington band. But when I had to make a choice, you can probably imagine that Isaac Hayes was paying me more than the Ellington band was. So I left the band, but by that time I had gained Mercer's respect to where when I left the band, he told me, so you got an open chair in this band. So when they ended up doing the Broadway show, Sophisticated Lady in New York, that gave me sort of incentive to move back to New York. It took me a year to move my family up to New York, but I moved to New York, Martin Luther King Day, January 15th, 1980. So that was my launch back to New York after being in Memphis, Tennessee for 10 years. My hero, Frank West, he said to me when I first got there, he said, if you want to play jazz, you got to travel all over the world. If you want to live in New York, you got to play all kinds of music. So that was my choice. So looking back over the years, I may be with Jesse Norman this week and Ruth Brown next week. I may be playing a country club this week and the Baby Grand next week.
Baby Grand.
Yeah.
They had a Baby Grand both in Brooklyn and in New York, in Manhattan.
I played the one on 125th Street.
And I used to hang out there with my friend again, Willis. We used to go there. And I remember going there in the bar one day, and there was this woman that was sitting at the bar by herself. And Willis went on to the bathroom, but he said, I know where you'll be at. Came out the bathroom. I was still sitting beside the wall. He said, what, you ain't over there? I said, no. She's drinking champagne at $25 a bottle.
Oh, hey, man, we could go off into about 100. Just that story triggers about 10.
Yes.
There's stories that I have a little tinge to them, and I'm hesitant about telling all of them. But you just can't make this stuff up, man. And you got to live it. And that's why I don't say music is not the center of my life. My life is the center of music, man. When I play my music, I try to tell all these stories on my horn. You understand? So it's
Name some of the other shows that you've been a part of
Jelly.
besides Sophisticated Lady. And by the way, I went to see Sophisticated Lady, so I must have saw you in the
Greg,
in the
Greg,
in the
no,
orchestra
they
pit.
were on the band. Yeah, we were on the band, on bandstand both sides. I did, and Gregory Hahn, Judith Jamerson.
Wasn't Phyllis Hyman in that one?
Phyllis
Yes.
Hyman. You understand? So that was 8 shows a week. You understand? So when I look back at my life, I can put them into chunks, and there's dissertation by itself just on that one period of time. Jelly Jam also with Gregory Hines, you understand? I did The Wiz when it came back to most of my shows were black shows, you understand?
Okay.
But Black and Blue play on there's 10 of them all together. And the last one I did, they were trying to bring back Shuffle Along, George Wolfe. I did a couple of shows for George Wolfe. And Shuffle Along came out at the same time that it's the one that lasted forever and ever. I'm having senior moments here. That's still there about the founding of the country with black founding fathers, Hamilton. So they opened the same time. But a lot of George Wolfe's things had some real truth about black people and their experience. And the average person paying a couple $100 for a ticket, they don't want to go to the theater and get depressed. Even though it's the truth, people are much more willing to pay money for a fantasy than they are for the truth. So they didn't necessarily run that long, even though they were great.
But I remember before I moved to where I moved to right now, still in Brooklyn, but I'm more downtown Brooklyn now. Before I was in Bedford-Stuyvesant, and I lived not too far away from a house that was inherited. A friend of mine inherited, not from relatives, but from, I guess, a family friend, and it was U.B. Blake. And of course, he did Shuffle Along. That's why I said
Yeah.
that. Back
Now, let
in
me
the,
ask you, what about Pumpkins? You know, a club called Pumpkins?
oh yes, I knew
Okay.
Pumpkins on.
Brooklyn was like a
Yeah,
world in
but let me
itself.
tell you a story about Pumpkins. Because Pumpkins was on Nostrand
There you
and
go.
Church Avenue.
Yeah.
I'm out in Los Angeles. When I would go into Pumpkin, there were certain records that I used to like to hear.
And yeah.
And they had both black and white songs on the jukebox. And I was in California, and I went to this fundraiser for the governor of California, Gray Davis. And at the fundraiser was Jerry. What was Jerry? He was partner with Herb Alpert on A&M Records.
Okay.
And
All right.
A&M Records was the one who put
Okay.
out the record by, these were records by, these particular songs were by Sergio Mendes. I walked over to Jerry and said, look, there's a black bar on Nostrand Avenue that have your records in it.
That's right. Yeah, I worked there one night a week. This is way later. But I worked there with an organ player, like a Wednesday night or Monday night, something like that. But for a long time, and he died. Yeah, but I would work there, not all the time, but because he
Oh,
changed.
yes, I do remember Pumpkins. And I saw in something that I read about you, which was funny, is that round the corner from Pumpkins, it was a little bit further down near Flatbush Avenue, between Flatbush
Yeah.
and
I'm trying
Bedford.
to picture it in my mind now.
There was a bar on Martin's. And one of the people that I used to know that would hang out there was somebody that you played with,
Who's
Dakota
that?
Staten.
Oh, yeah. Well, I met Dakota Staten in Pittsburgh. And it was right after I left George Benson. I was trying to get my own band. I'm young and ambitious. The band that I ended up with, both my great piano player, that Max and everybody tried to get, but he had mental problems. But both my bass player, my piano player, and my bass player were in the mental institution. But they would just get out when we had work. So I got a call to play with my band back in Dakota State. So I was so excited, man, because she's a big star. I remembered her, all her records and things. She disappeared for a while. But
Yes, she
they
did.
all knew each other. So when we get on the gig, and it was some town outside of Pittsburgh, Braddock or something. So when we get on a gig, she made the piano player mad right from as soon as we got there. So on the gig, he had her music and he changed keys and put the intro in another key. He couldn't throw. I think she had perfect pitch because he couldn't throw her. But she's screaming and hollering at him all night long. I'm the leader, and I'm trying to get through the night, and I'm trying to play behind her and get through the night. So finally, when we took a break, the piano player, the bass player, whose name was Marcus Kelly, and the piano player's name was Santee Bow. The bass player's big guy, and he put his arm around Dakota. He said, "Now, Dakota, you're going to have to excuse Santee because he's been sick." She says, "Sick? Do you think I'm well?" She said, "Crazy people play the best music. So don't give me that lame excuse about him." I was so devastated.
When you talking about she had gone down and then she was back up, that was during the time that she was down when she would hang out at the bar at Martin's.
Listen, I can see it. But to make a long story short, I said, I'll never lead another band for the rest of my life. And I pretty much stuck to that. So years and years later, when I'm back in New York, I was on the road with a company of sophisticated ladies. We were down in Texas somewhere, and Dakota State was playing at a club there, and we went to see Dakota State. And Phyllis Hyman was, not Phyllis Hyman, but Bring the Boys Home.
Frida Payne.
Frida Payne was out on the door playing the lead of Sophisticated Ladies, but we went to see Dakota State. So I said, now this was 15 years ago. Dakota won't remember me. So somebody introduced, and this is Bill Easley. She said, "Bill Easley?" She said, "I wonder whatever happened to you, man." She said, "You helped me make it through that night." She remembered every detail of the gig and where we went to breakfast afterwards and all of it. So she had me play on the next record she did. She had me play, I think it was called Save Your Love For. Might have been her last record, but she invited me to play on her last LP or whatever it was back in those days.
One more question before I let you tell the audience what your future plans are. Did you know Sarah McLawler?
Yeah. Man, you and I, man, we could
I used to manage Sarah McLawler.
Oh, man. See, listen, you think you call yourself stuff because you know the stuff in everybody else. Man. See, I can't believe this. Okay, now, again, man, I'll try. It's hard for me to make stuff short. But I met her. My uncle owned a club in Pittsburgh called the Hurricane. And so I was a teenager, and I went and stayed with my aunt and uncle for about a month or a couple of weeks or 3 weeks. And at their club at that time, the trio that was Sarah McLaughlin and Richard Otto was her husband. He played violin, Sarah McLaughlin. I would go there and I'd hear them all every night, man. And many years later, I met her in New York in the 80s or 90s or whatever. But I knew her when I was about 15 years old. You managed her.
It was only for a hot minute, but it was in the early 70s, mid 70s. Okay.
See, now listen, man. The thing is, again, I'm here, man, mainly because of the whole about stuff, about your theme, about that. See, that fascinates me like you can't imagine, because everybody's got stuff. Everybody has stuff. But what the miraculous thing is, man, once you start talking, man, all the stuff connects, man.
It connects. Now, tell my audience what your future plans are. What are you do it? Have you retired or you are
Yeah,
still gigging?
okay. I'm going to even, tell something personal, man. Heart valve replacement or something. It's a procedure.
Mhm.
And it could be great. It could be, but anytime you go through any kind of surgery or whatever, especially, I'm 80 years old, but I'm in great shape. So I am very confident to where if I go through with it, I can't imagine my life being improved in terms of how I feel and the joy that I have in my body right now. And I'm blessed. I live in 5 states: the state of truth, the state of gratitude, the state of joy, the state of peace, and the state of love. And I try to stay out of the state of confusion. And I'm doing it. I feel good every single day of my life, man. But there's a valve that's not working or something. It's probably been not working for years and years. So I'm going to see about getting this valve replaced. But by the same token, I'm going to tell the doctor, man, look, man, this is where I am right now. And I'd rather die than be an invalid and be laying up in bed even for 2 weeks or for a month. In other words, if I'm going to live for 20 years, I don't want last thing in the world I ever want to be is an old man. I refuse to be an old man because you're every age that you've ever been. And I'm 80, but in my mind, I can flash back to 18 just like that, and I can be 18. And anybody's capable of it if they want to do it. But I'm living my best life at 80. My wife calls me King William, and all I do is take out the garbage. But
And
see
what's
if
your
they,
wife's name?
Marcia, she's a big wheel.
Okay.
She's a big wheel.
I want to say that all the best to you. And I want to thank you so much for being on the broadcast. And
But
when you are back on your feet, I want to have lunch or dinner with you.
I'll come to New York to do it, man. Or you can come to my house, man. You can come. I got a beautiful guest room. Not only will I let you stay in my guest room, I got a huge bathtub. I'll let you play with my toy boats, man. I'm
Thank you
serious.
so much. And I'm looking forward to it. I'm really looking forward to it.
All
Have a
right, man.
wonderful day. That's it for the show about stuff, the Stephen Davis Show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for tuning in this week. Hope you enjoyed this show about stuff. See you next time.